Kaiju, giant monsters, strange beasts. Throughout all of our history, these creatures of legend have ravaged humanity. Some have brought doom to us, others have saved our kind. And today, I would like to highlight one of the thousands of kaiju from our popular culture, going over who they are, their story, their real-life history, and more. I'm your host, Minecraft World, and this is Let's Talk Kaiju. Episode 2, Gamera. Spoiler warning, you have been warned. The year was 1964. Godzilla is taking off and Toho Studios was growing to be the go-to for kaiju films across the globe, getting more and more popular in the East and West as the rise of television continued to grow worldwide. And with that success, many wanted to capitalize on it with their own giant monster, attempting to ride along with or rival that of Toho's very own Star Child. Enter Daiei, a longtime rival studio to Toho. Having witnessed the success of Godzilla, Daiei's CEO Yuichi Nagano wanted the studio to try their own hand at a kaiju film, and as such, following a searching around of ideas, Daiei eventually settled on a film that would become 1964's giant horde beast Nezura. The film was to be directed by Mitsuo Murayama and was about genetically mutated rats rampaging through Tokyo. However, giant horde beast Nezura didn't come to fruition. To make the film, the crew would wrangle up live rats, which would patrol and destroy the miniature sets representing the locations in the film. There were two problems, however. One, live rats are really hard to work with, especially in a film setting, and two, there was a growing public concern of disease spread due to multiple instances of rats escaping. And as such, to make a very long story short, production ceased on Nezura and the rats were quickly disposed of. However, Daiei, still adamant in making a kaiju film, continued to search for ideas, and soon they decided on a different story. And despite having some hesitancy due to the project being a little too similar to Godzilla, they would go through with it, assigning director Noriaki Yuasa to helm it. And in 1965, 1 year after Nezura was canned, Daiei would release the film to premiere their Star Child. Gamera, the giant monster, or for those in the West, Gamera, the Invincible, spelled with 2 M's for some reason. When an atomic bomb is dropped in the Arctic, a large bipedal turtle dubbed Gamera, which literally just means turtle, is awakened and goes on a rampage. After multiple attempts at stopping him, all of which ending in failure in some sort of wacky way, the Japanese government has to rely on the help of a young boy, Toshio, renamed Kenny in the English dub, in order to end the Titanic Terrapin's rampage. Despite Daiei's concerns, Gamera was an absolute success, and had brought forth the rival to Toho that many had failed to achieve. And with that, they took as much opportunity as they could. Despite the film's very blatant copying of Godzilla, the thing that allowed Gamera to be on a similar level of success to him was the fact that, unlike his Toho counterpart, he was portrayed as a far more heroic and benevolent kaiju. He explicitly goes out of his way to save Toshio multiple times and doesn't actively attack humanity. Whenever he unlocks a new power, he either uses it to escape and hide or help himself, and that would become a winning formula for future films. Daiei went full steam ahead on a sequel, releasing Gamera vs. Barugon in 1966. The film took a far more serious approach in tone, featuring no child characters in the story and pit Gamera, following him returning after being launched into space at the end of his first film, against his first ever kaiju opponent, Barugon. The beast was an ancient godly lizard that stood quadrupedally and boasted a wide variety of powers that gave both the human military and Gamera himself a run for his money, such as a long tongue that can spew a freezing spray and a bright heated rainbow beam from his back that exploded everything that came into contact. Gamera vs. Barugon, whilst slightly less of a success in comparison to the first film, was still a success, cementing Gamera into the public eye for good and alerting Toho to their new rival, something that would affect the output of their films for the next decade. However, there was one large gripe with Gamera vs. Barugon: the lack of young children. As such, the kids who did watch it found it either too boring or too scary, and, as such, Daiei would have their following Gamera films be more kid-oriented. 1967 saw that action put into effect, with Daiei releasing Gamera vs. Gyaos, which carried the same lighthearted and campy elements, even being sillier than its two predecessors. However, the film itself is treated as mostly straight, and does have just as many unsettling and serious moments as it does campy ones. Gamera vs. Gyaos is also important in the character's legacy in that it introduced Gamera's greatest reoccurring foe, Gyaos, a giant bat bird-like creature that is nocturnal, spews a supersonic laser that can cut through anything, and has a taste for human flesh, making him a perfect foil for Gamera having such a close connection to humanity. And with that, a winning formula had been established, and as such, Daiei continued pumping out sequel after sequel. From the grounded mystical journey of Gamera vs. Jiger to the comedic sci-fi romps that were Gamera vs. Virus and Gamera vs. Guiron. The Gamera Showa era brought forth far more lighthearted stories of the late 1960s and early to mid-1970s, which was only further encouraged by the releases of the Ultraman shows and the Showa Godzilla films. However, a wider problem would rear its head. As the films continued, they would become less and less successful, with the budgets getting lower and lower as Daiei came closer and closer to a grave financial loss. This would ultimately reach its breaking point in 1971 with Gamera vs. Zigra. Despite introducing a very unique kaiju into Gamera's rogues gallery, the film flopped hard at the box office, ultimately cementing Daiei's filing for bankruptcy and dealing with the riots that resulted from that. However, Gamera wouldn't finish the decade on a whimper, and in 1980, Daiei, slowly recovering from the bankruptcy, would try one last time with Gamera Super Monster. The film was a reboot featuring a tale of a young boy meeting with 3 extraterrestrial superheroes on a quest in order to stop an evil alien threat, which uses Earth's monsters to do their bidding. That is, until Gamera gets involved. The film, well, to say it didn't do well would be a massive understatement. The more accurate description would be that it was the final nail in the coffin for not just the Gamera Showa era, but the Kaiju Showa era as a whole. The film, to this day, is considered the worst ever entry in Gamera's roster, and consistently makes the list among one of the worst ever kaiju films ever made, with the reasons tending to be the annoying insanity of the human scenes, the blatant imitation of popular blockbusters at the time, most notably Star Wars, and the shameless reuse of previous fight scenes from every single film prior to it. And with that, Gamera would go into hibernation, patiently awaiting for his parent studio to get back upon their feet and reintroduce him to the world once again. And 15 years later, the time for that would come. Flash forward to the year 1995. Godzilla had just ended his Heisei era and had gone into hibernation for the next few years. And by that time, Daiei had been recovering, and as such, they had decided to bring back their star child. This wasn't the first time Daiei had tried to revive him. Towards the late 80s and early 90s, Daiei had looked into multiple concepts for reviving Gamera, including creating a short film dubbed Gamera vs. Gyre-Sharp about Gamera fighting a giant snake. However, that wasn't enough to bring the giant turtle back. Enter Shusuke Kaneko. He, along with Shinji Higuchi and many more, had been tasked with bringing Gamera back into the public eye, and that is exactly what he would do. Releasing in 1995, 1996, and 1999, Kaneko and his team would create a trilogy of films that would, to this day, not only serve as what is widely considered to be the best pieces of material in Gamera's catalog, but also some of the best material that the kaiju genre has had to offer. First came Gamera, Guardian of the Universe, released in 1995. The film reintroduced the Titanic Terrapin in a much darker fashion, reimagining him as a man-made beast created by the ancient city of Atlantis, created in order to destroy his opponent, Gyaos, reimagined here as a ravenous apocalyptic destroyer who had been given the moniker of the Shadow of Evil and was responsible for the destruction of Atlantis. 1 year later, released in 1996, was Gamera 2, Advent of Legion. The film took place 1 year after the first and told the story of humanity having to place their trust into Gamera as he battles to save humanity from a massive alien insect kaiju dubbed Legion. And finally, 3 years after that, released in 1999, Gamera 3, Revenge of Iris. The film was far darker in comparison to its predecessors, telling the story of Ayana Hirasaka, a young girl who lost her family during the final battle of the first film, as she discovers Iris, a last resort creation of Atlantis in case Gamera went rogue. Meanwhile, Gamera appears to have turned on humanity as, in his battle against a massively growing population of Gyaos, he starts causing massive levels of devastation. When they were released, all three films were given gigantic critical and commercial praise, even with Guardian of the Universe winning several awards as well as getting an American theatrical screening. However, Revenge of Iris was not able to meet the number proposed by Kaneko for a fourth film. One of the biggest things that made these films as beloved as they are was their very heavy and poignant themes and imagery. The films are far darker than that of the Showa films, with overarching themes of human nature, environmentalism, and faith/trust, with Revenge of Iris bringing those themes to their peak. However, as stated, the trilogy would officially remain a trilogy, and Gamera would go dormant for the next few years, with no new material outside of fan projects like Shinbei Hayashi's Gamera 4, Truth, an unofficial sequel to Revenge of Iris that pit Gamera against an albino Gyaos, or a scrapped Godzilla vs. Gamera film from 2002. And soon, Daiei would fall into bankruptcy once again. However, Gamera would make a triumphant comeback in 2006 with the help of Kadokawa in the form of Gamera, the Brave. The film, being Gamera's only entry in the Millennium Era, was a reboot that showed Gamera sacrificing his life in order to save humanity from the Gyaos. However, his egg is discovered by a young boy, Toru, and he tasks himself with taking care of the newborn Gamera, whom he names Todo. After the arrival of a new man-eating monster named Zetas, Toru has to learn to let go of Todo in order for him to stop and defeat him. The film was a semi-throwback to the Showa era, with it having kids taking center stage for the story. However, the film was far more grounded and heartful, with a surprisingly somber story about grief and maturity and learning to deal with loss. That being said, Gamera the Brave wasn't enough to meet the studio's demands, and as such, Gamera was sent into hibernation once again, and this time he would linger there for longer than usual. Later, at G-Fest 2015, Daiei had released a trailer-style short film in order to celebrate the character's 50th anniversary, depicting Gamera stopping a giant swarm of Gyaos and coming back a decade after that to stop another unnamed monster. And that was enough to get fans excited, though it was mostly due to the fact that it was misrepresented as a trailer for an upcoming film. However, Daiei did take notice, and they decided they would get to work. Over the course of the next few years, Daiei, who had merged with Kadokawa Pictures, would begin work on reintroducing their star child back into the limelight. Gamera Rebirth would be released in 2023, premiering on Netflix and directed by Hideyuki Seshita, and would be the grand return fans had asked for after 17 long years. And this time, the character would be portrayed in animation. Gamera Rebirth, despite being another reboot, harkened back to the Showa era in terms of story and monsters, telling the story of 4 young kids named Boko, Joe, Brody, and Junichi, who are all wrapped up in a government organization and an ancient conspiracy that threatens to wipe out humanity, and having to team up with Gamera in order to stop it, facing 5 different monsters reawakened by these actions, those being Gyaos, Jiger, Zigra, Gueron, and Virus. However, the series also incorporated a lot of aspects from Gamera's other material, utilizing a similar design philosophy and kaiju origin to that of the Heisei trilogy, making Gamera and his opponents all the creations of ancient Atlantis, and depicting Gamera as a far more ferocious beast than normal, as well as keeping a very similar tone and feel to that of Gamera the Brave, taking itself a lot more seriously but still having that young, adventurous feel, telling its coming-of-age story about growing up and dealing with struggle. When it was released, Gamera Rebirth was nearly universally beloved, with many praising it for its story and its absolutely glorious kaiju action. However, many did deride its animation style, which was a mostly stiff 3D style that, whilst not terribly looking for the kaiju, did look off-putting for the humans. But still, many were just happy to see their beloved giant turtle back in the limelight, whilst others, despite enjoying the series, eagerly await the day Gamera returns to the big screen. Throughout his tumultuous history, Gamera has gone through thick and thin, from being among the laughingstocks of the age to finding his own and genuinely managing to overthrow the King of Monsters in quality for a time, to his new recognition in animated form. It is certain that many eagerly anticipate when and where the Guardian of the Universe may show up next. I have been your host, Minecraft World, and this has been Let's Talk Kaiju. Next time, we look at the 8th wonder of the world himself, King Kong.